very quickly wrap up chapter 50 and move on into chapter 51, and then maybe do something interesting with chapter 52, depending on how things go. We'll see what happens. Jeremiah chapter 50, where we'll pick up in our study together tonight. Well, we've come a long way. Okay, we've talked a lot about historical aspects. We've talked a lot about the judgments that God has, and throughout the first 44 chapters of this book, who has been the focus of God's judgment? Judah has been, right? Judah has been the focus. God's people have been the focus of His judgment for the first 45 chapters of the book of Jeremiah. We come to chapter 46, and what's God do? He turns His attention to whom? Other nations, like Egypt, Edom, Moab, Ammon, Damascus, Kedar, Hazor. Okay, he spends his time then from chapters 46 through 49 dealing with those, and then interestingly in chapters 50 and 51, who's he bring his judgment against? Babylon. Okay, we've been using Babylon all this time. We use Babylon to deal with Judah. We use Babylon to deal with these other nations. But what happened with them?
We got too proud.
Oh.
Proud.
Okay, they became too proud. They began to think their successes were due to whom?
Themselves.
Due to themselves, right? They began to think of themselves as haughty and lofty. We saw those kinds of words in reference to them. And so, because of that, God says, I'm not excusing you. Yes, I used you as a nation to bring down these other places. I've had a purpose for you. But it doesn't excuse you to act haughty and think of yourselves better and not respect who I am, Jehovah says. And so he spends chapter 50 and 51, Jeremiah does, in bringing judgment from God against Babylon. And that's what we've been talking about. We did that Sunday morning, and we continue to do that. I want you to notice verse 40. That's about where we stopped Sunday morning. But I want you to notice something of interest. At least I found it interesting. Who does he reference? What places does he reference? The judgment that's coming to Babylon is reference to that of Sodom and Gomorrah. What kind of destruction came there? Utter destruction, right? Completely devastated by the judgment of God. And he evokes that imagery to help them understand the kind of judgment that he's bringing against them. We'll see more of that kind of language actually in chapter 51 when he describes the kind of judgment that he's bringing against Babylon. But it is overwhelming. And it is interestingly so because how large had Babylon grown?
Quite large.
Yeah, they were everywhere, right? You know, we could throw a map up, and I didn't put one ready tonight, but if we put a map on the screen, they took over everywhere. I mean, as far as the eye could see, in that region of the world, they seemed that it would be impossible to what? They could ever be overthrown. How could anything ever happen to them? How would it be possible for any kind of challenge or difficulty to ever happen to Babylon? But what's the one thing that anybody that overthinks their power or their strength, what's the one equalizer, or who is the one equalizer? God is, right? God can take the most powerful and make them the weakest. He can take the strong and devastate them. He can take anything that he deems needful of judgment, and he can bring forth not just a judgment, but decisive and complete and devastating judgment, because he is God. And that's what Babylon is learning in this text. Where's this trouble going to come from? North. Isn't that interesting? Because in all the descriptions to Judah and all those other places, where did God tell them the trouble was coming from? From the north. He meant Babylon. Now you got to go just a smidge further north, and who's coming? The Medes, and eventually they're known as the Medo-Persian Empire. How do we know they were coming? Or did Babylon have any hint that they were going to eventually fall?
Yes.
Yes. How do they know that?
From the dream.
The contemporary to Jeremiah was Daniel, right? Daniel's back in Babylon. They're the same time period, okay? Daniel gets taken away when?
Early.
Early on, right? In the early captivity. And so Daniel's back, and he gains power and gains prominence among the Babylonians, and he becomes a part of this equation, has some difficulties along the path, but he becomes influential. Nebuchadnezzar has the dream. Daniel comes and explains it. It basically describes a series of nations. One would supersede the other for a period of time until that great nation under whom would come? Christ. Okay, and that's the picture. So Babylon had Daniel telling them from this dream and prophetic kind of interpretation that there was demise coming. Jeremiah says, it's coming. From the north, it's coming. And you're going to be devastated by it. Notice the description in verse 44. Behold, the enemy shall come like a lion from the pride of the Jordan against the strong habitation. For I will suddenly make them run away from it, and whoso is chosen, him will I appoint over it, for who is like me, and who will appoint me a time, and who is the shepherd that can stand before me. What's God basically saying in that verse through Jeremiah?
Nothing you
Right,
can do.
who can stop me? Who is comparable to me? Who can tell me what? What time to do something or not to do something? Give me a leader that's more powerful. Where's the shepherd that could keep me from scattering a flock if I chose to do so? And God just continually through this description gives them detail after detail of, in some senses, anything they might think of. They might say, well, we're still around and nothing's happening. God says, I'm working on my time, not yours. We've got great leadership. God says, I can take leadership down in a heartbeat. And so everything you might think of that they would maybe attach themselves to find some kind of security in all this, God through the prophet just tells them, none of that's going to work. It's not going to help you through all that. So who should they listen to? Verse 45. Hear ye the counsel of Jehovah, that he hath taken against Babylon and his purposes, that he hath purposed against the land of the Chaldeans. Surely they shall drag them away, even the little ones of the flock. Surely he shall make their habitation desolate over them. At the noise of the taking of Babylon, the earth trembleth, and the cry is heard among the nations. And so this is going to be a completely devastating judgment that's coming. Any thoughts about chapter 50? Chapter 51, this is really a continuation.
2 words. Pride and complacency will take us down every time.
Yeah, anybody can fall by those two
That's
challenges.
what happened to that.
Pride and complacency and an unwillingness to acknowledge where true blessing comes from.
That's pride.
And it's what pride leads you to.
Yeah.
And that's why it's dangerous in that perspective. Because it leads men to reject where genuine strength and power really resides. And it resides in the hands of God.
Where was Jeremiah located at this time? Is he in Babylon? Or is
He's in Egypt.
He's in
Remember,
Egypt.
there's no indication that he ever got out of there. To my knowledge, there's no biblical indication that after, you remember when all those folks fled and they took him with them, to my knowledge, that he is still there. And again, remember, don't think of the book of Jeremiah, he prophesied this, then he prophesied that. It is just a collection. There's no real chronology to it. And don't, well, wait till he gets to chapter 52. But we'll get there. All right, so anything else about chapter 50 before I jump to chapter 51? Because they really just need to be tied together because they're part 1, part 2 of the judgment against Babylon. All right, so let's look at Jeremiah chapter 51. So again, he's still talking about the same thing. His judgment against Babylon. He's going to send unto Babylon, verse 2, strangers that shall winnow her, and they shall empty her land. For in the day of trouble they shall be against her round about. When you think about being encompassed like that, there's not going to be any escape from this. There's no way to avoid it. This is coming. And they're going to have to address that. Jump down to verse 7. And I've kind of outlined in my own notes where I want to go in the chapter. If I've skipped over something you want me to go back to, then just stop me and I'll go back. But I'm going to bounce a little bit as we move through the chapter. Notice what he describes them as, because the whole thing is just basically you're going down. You know, if you wanted to sum up these 2 chapters, Babylon's going to be destroyed. And that's really what the text is about, and it gives some details. It says, Babylon hath been a golden cup in Jehovah's hand, that made all the earth drunken. The nations have drunk of her wine, therefore the nations are mad. The only reason Babylon had any kind of power or influence or success was because of whom? God gave them the golden cup. The problem is, now all these other nations that have been kind of consumed by Babylon are drinking from that cup, and they think the cup belongs to who? They think it belongs to Babylon. Okay, they're Babylonian mad is the way Jeremiah describes this. They have just completely given them, and so they're going to stand astounded when God brings down the great Babylon. God allowed them to carry the golden cup around for a while, and everybody's kind of, drunk from the cup. But it's going to be an amazing thing to many when the destruction eventually comes.
The dream of Nebuchadnezzar go ahead was Babylon.
Yeah. There's that imagery is seen in other things that God has said on top of it. Absolutely. Notice verse 9. We would have healed Babylon, but she is not healed. Forsake her. Let us go every one into his own country, for her judgment reacheth unto heaven, and is lifted up even to the skies. Basically, everyone who has been a captive, everyone who has been in bondage to Babylon is told that they're going to do what?
Get out of town.
Go back to your own country, because Babylon is not what she once was. We could have healed her if she had not become proud, if she had not become lofty and haughty towards God. But she, like every other nation who refused any level of penitence, was going to have to meet with the consequences that God would bring. And so he tells them, get ready. Notice he even knows who's coming. Verse 11. Hold firm the shields. Jehovah hath stirred up the spirit of the kings of the Medes. Okay? He basically just tells them right there where the problem is going to come from. Because his purpose is against Babylon, to destroy it. For it is the vengeance of Jehovah, the vengeance of his what? Temple. Of his temple. And Jeremiah gives some interesting descriptions, and I want to be careful with them. But I also want to note that there seems to be some judgment from God based on the manner in which Babylon dealt with his house. Because this reference has come back a couple of different times where the condemnation is connected to the manner in which they dealt with the temple of God. And I recognize that God's intention was to bring other devastation into Judah, but I can't help but also get somewhat of a feeling that maybe he was I don't know what the word is, but frustrated and is reaping vengeance because of the manner in which they dealt and desecrated the things of the temple. And eventually, when they we know this, Daniel chapter 5, when Belshazzar falls, what's he having? He's having a party, and what's he using? He's using utensils that they had brought out of the temple. So this may be somewhat prophetic about what's going to come to them when the Medes come in and why. You've defiled the utensils of the temple. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar is going to come along after you, and he's going to actually be using the things you've taken for spoil in idolatrous worship that should always have remained in covenant to God. And so there's some of that kind of feel about why God's bringing this
The
judgment.
same statement was made in verse 28 of chapter 50.
Yeah, that's what I mean when we see it before about this concept that they apparently went maybe beyond what God had intended. Now we got a few minutes. We don't talk about that sometimes, Roger, in our discussions, but some of the problem we create for ourselves is that God says, here's what I expect, here's what I desire from you. And then we tend to want to go, what? One step further than what God has given. And we go one step beyond what He actually desired from us. And we create ourselves a whole nother. That is just as much a problem as falling short of what God wants from us. And so that's a caution maybe that Babylon had rejected. Yeah, God empowered them to go take care of His business. But it appears that they went beyond just doing what God had asked of them and defiled elements of the temple and things in ways that they should not have involved themselves. And now the vengeance is coming. And so it's one thing to say Babylon was just the tool that God used, but it appears that they had gone beyond even what He had desired.
Also, when God said, "I set everything up," but all Levi had to take care of, and to kill any stranger coming in, you know they had to go in and get this done some way. Whatever.
Yeah.
So they had to be responsible for all that.
Right.
It's like David did when they took it out and tried to transport it. They did it the wrong way, so it's not a good thing.
And it brings challenge.
And once you go that one step further, it's hard to get back.
Right. And here's why, and let's just think about the relationship with Babylon to make a parallel. But why do you think the pride and the loftiness kicked in? Well, we went one step beyond, and look how much greater success we had. And that happens with folks. If you've gone one step beyond and you're being corrected, you're going to have to acknowledge that, have to have a willingness to acknowledge it, and do what? Step back into where you should be. And pride sometimes won't let us do that. Or pride hinders us, challenges us from doing it. We go beyond and we say, well, I don't want to. I have to admit that I went too far.
I was wrong.
I don't want to admit that I was wrong, so we never step back because we have to acknowledge we shouldn't have been there to begin with. Notice verse 13. O thou that dwellest upon many waters, abundant in treasures, thine end is come, the measure of thy covetousness. Jehovah of hosts has sworn by Himself, saying, surely I will fill thee with men as with the cankerworm, and they shall lift up a shout against thee. Is there anything that you can make an oath upon greater than God says, I make a vow upon I make an oath upon myself as to the things that are about to occur and the things that are about to happen. I'm bringing this judgment. And He says, your abundant treasures, meaningless. Your end is coming. And the truth is, we talk about that from a personal standpoint. You can accumulate all day long. But ultimately, what's the greatest equalizer of all things? Death. Right? There are no rich and poor. Right? Once you're gone, there's no rich and poor anymore. The treasures are meaningless at that point. And so they can count on it all day long, but He says, your end is coming anyway. And I've made an oath upon myself that I'm going to bring this judgment, and it's going to eat at you in ways you never would have thought possible. Verse 17. Notice here's the description. Every man is become brutish and is without knowledge. Every goldsmith is put to shame by its image, for his molten image is falsehood, and there is no breath in them. So, ignorance is not always bliss. And they chose to be willfully ignorant of what God would desire from them. And they had again, even though it was Jehovah God who had blessed them, allowed them to build their empire, even at the expense of God's own people, and at the end of the day, they still took the credit for it themselves, and were still worshiping their idols, and they were still honoring those things that had no breath or life in them at all. It makes no sense whatsoever for them to be trusting in the things they are, knowing their leadership especially should have known where those blessings had come from. The judgment's on its way. I want you to notice verse 20. Thou art my battle axe and weapons of war. And with thee, speaking of God, I believe in this narrative, with thee will I break in pieces the nations, and with thee will I destroy kingdoms. With thee will I break in pieces the horse and his rider. With thee will I break in pieces the the chariot, and him that rideth therein. And with thee will I break in pieces man and woman. And with thee will I break in pieces the old man and the youth. And with thee will I break in pieces the young man and the virgin. And with thee will I break in pieces the shepherd and his flock. And with thee will I break in pieces the husbandman and his yoke of oxen. With thee will I break in pieces governors and deputies. And I will render unto Babylon and to all the inhabitants of Chaldea all their evil that they have done in Zion in your sight, saith Jehovah. And so he's guaranteeing, if you will, with the strength of God behind it, the devastation that he would ultimately bring, and what God can accomplish even when men would think an impossibility. Thoughts or questions up to that point? Well, I try to get rid of that off my screen.
Nobody will be able to escape. Everybody will be.
Right. And that's the list. It's there's no removing what's coming to these folks. Notice verse 26. They shall not take of thee a stone for a corner, nor a stone for foundations, but thou shalt be desolate forever, saith Jehovah. I found that interesting, because the implication of that is that no aspect of Babylonian culture, rule, law, government. Notice he said, I will not take of thee a stone for a corner, nor a stone for foundations. Thou shalt be desolate forever. Nobody after this point is going to use anything from you to rebuild. And this isn't a matter of knocking you away for a few years and then you reestablishing yourselves later. There will be no corner left. There will be no foundation for anybody to rebuild you as you once were. All that's going away.
That's the sum of it. There will be nothing left for them to rebuild on.
Yeah.
Absolutely nothing. If you don't have the cornerstone, you have nowhere to go.
Yeah. No guideline.
No guidance.
It was the same pronouncement on Sodom and Gomorrah too.
Yeah. No.
It'd never be inhabited. Nobody would ever pitch their tents there. Nothing.
Right. And when God determines to bring judgment, it is severe and not to be reckoned with, and should be avoided when He gives us warning of how to do so. Notice verse 31. He describes how, as events will unfold for them, how all this is going to happen. One post shall run to meet another, and one messenger to meet another, to show the king of Babylon that his city is taken on every quarter. And so it reminds me a little bit, if you remember in the days of Job, and one messenger shows up with bad news, and he no more than gets that breath out, then what? Here comes another messenger, and that's the imagery here. That God says when this judgment comes, and when Babylon begins to be taken over, He said the king will be so devastated by the fact that at every turn another messenger from another city is going to come and say they've fallen. One after another, the messengers will come and report the things that they had seen and witnessed and the challenges that had come. And the passages are seized, verse 32. The reeds they have burned with fire, and the men of war are what? That is not a report that your king wants to hear. Your cities are falling apart. We are becoming powerless. And even the men of war are scared. It is going to be rough when this judgment of God comes down upon them. And he continues to describe that. The vengeance that he's going to bring up. The heats that will become. A dwelling place for jackals, verse 37. An astonishment and a hissing without inhabitant. Those are languages and descriptions that we have heard in prior passages as well. Notice verse 44. And I will execute judgment upon Bel and Babylon, I will bring forth out of his mouth that which he hath swallowed up, and the nation shall not flow any more unto him. Yea, the wall of Babylon shall fall. I found it interesting that he said, at one point every nation seemed to be flowing into Babylon, but that's going to stop. The flow of captives and those that they could use for their purposes eventually is going to dry up. Everything is collapsing when this judgment comes. Jump to verse 53. Though Babylon should mount up to heaven, and though she should fortify the height of her strength, yet for me shall destroyers come unto her, saith Jehovah. Now, you think about it. One of the descriptions of Jesus' return is that he's coming like a what? Like a thief in the night. And the implication of that is what? That you don't you don't know. Okay, you don't know when the thief is coming. You don't have any prior warning. Not exactly the case with Babylon, is it? Okay, they know that the judgment is coming, if they believe it anyway. They know it's coming, and they even know who. Where it's coming from and who it is, right? They're told, the Medes. They're told it's coming from the north. So if you have prior warning, what do?
Fortify.
Right, you fortify. You're ready, right? You prepare yourself. You get ready for it. And so God tells them there in verse 53, go ahead and mount it up to the heavens. You can pile all the weaponry, whatever you want to do. It doesn't matter if you build up your fortresses to the heavens. Though you fortify the height of her strength, I'll bring destroyers that can bring it down anyway. You can't build enough power. You can't build enough strength. You cannot secure yourselves enough. The destruction's coming. The sound of a cry from Babylon and of a great destruction from the land of the Chaldeans. You can only imagine the thought processes of the nations round about as word would begin to spread that Babylon is falling. And the nation that seemed impossible for it to be destroyed is crumbling. And that cry, just as it pours out of that nation and that empire, we heard everywhere. Because God's laying it to waste. He says in verse 54. Notice now verse 59. So the word which Jeremiah the prophet commanded Seraiah the son of Neriah the son of Messiah when he went with Zedekiah the king of Judah to Babylon in the 4th year of his reign. Now Seraiah was chief chamberlain. Jeremiah wrote in a book all the evil that should come upon Babylon, even all these words that are written concerning Babylon. Jeremiah said to Seraiah, when thou comest to Babylon, then see that thou read all these words, and say, O Jehovah, thou hast spoken concerning this place, to cut it off, that none shall dwell therein, neither man nor beast, but that it shall be desolate forever. And it shall be, when thou hast made an end of reading this book, that thou shalt bind a stone to it, and cast it into the midst of the Euphrates. Thou shalt say, thus shall Babylon sink, and shall not rise again, because of the evil that I will bring upon her, and they shall be weary. Thus far are the words of Jeremiah. And so, he's going to do what with all this message?
Writing it all
He's going to
down.
write it all down. And he takes Seraiah, and he gives it to him, and he says, you take it up there, and you read it before them. You let them know of the judgment that's coming. And then he says, I want you to do something very symbolic with it. He says, I want you to take it and I want you to bind a stone to it. And I want you to throw it into the midst of the Euphrates. And I want you to let it sink, depicting the destruction and the sinking of the great empire of Babylon. And you can only imagine. It's hard to even imagine. here's this man going to go up and read this message, and then fulfill what Jeremiah gives him instruction to do.
Evidently, this was written quite a while ago for him to have, Sariah, or whatever his name is, was taken with Zedekiah, to have it to take there with him.
Yeah. And let me go back and look at that, because because timing's hard to figure those things out. I'm missing it. I know we read it. There it is. Yeah. And so it is interesting how some of these prophecies fit in time periods in various ways. And I think sometimes we get caught up in trying to think of it as he sent this message, and then he sent this message, and then he sent this message, and then he sent this message. We don't really have it that way. What we've got is, here's the message. Here's what Jeremiah wrote. Here's what he said. And here's whom he said it to at different times with different purposes. Let's run, if you have your question sheets, I'll use them by way of summary. You have to take the time to answer those real quick. Flip back and forth in the chapter. But what did verse 7 mean? Maybe we better go back and look at verse 7. So we can remember verse 7. Anybody write an answer down?
God is really in control, but Babylon and the others drink from the cup that God has given them,
Right.
and they think they're in control because they have the cup.
Right. This is God's cup. Okay, He gave it to them. All the blessings and benefits they had belong to God. And everybody was drinking, thinking they were drinking it from the hands of Babylon. But they weren't. And Babylon's going to fall, and all those who were trusting in Babylon would fall with them, for that matter. Who would the Lord raise up against Babylon? Verse 11. Yeah, that's me. We've mentioned that a couple of different times in our study. From verse 27, what small nations would be arrayed against Babylon?
Everett, and Asherah.
Okay, I'm not going to try it like this. What would the inhabitants of Zion say?
Blood upon the Chaldeans.
Okay. Anything else?
We want Babylon to be punished for their guilt.
Yeah, we want judgment, and punishment needs to come for the things they had done against God. What Babylonian god is mentioned in verse 44? Baal, right? We've seen different ones from different nations referenced from time to time. From verse 53, was there anything Babylon could do to stop this? No, there's nothing they're going to be able to do to hinder what God's going to do. What would happen to the walls of Babylon?
Broken down.
They'll be broken. They're going to fall. They're going to be brought down. Even go to the heavens, it doesn't matter. They're coming down. And who was Sariah, and what was he told to do in Babylon? Okay, he's a chamberlain. He's going to take the message.
Read it to them.
Right? Read it to them, and then tie that stone and put it into your freeze. Let them know, see this message sink as they're going to see.
From the relationships mentioned here, it sounds like he might have been the brother of Baruch.
Yeah,
Carry the other
it
messenger.
makes the other messenger. Yeah, I believe there is some connection there. I wasn't able to trace it all down, but there is potentially a connection between Sariah and Baruch, who we saw on a couple of different occasions that Jeremiah used and for the same purposes. Any lessons you thought of or thinking you want to note before I move away from the chapter itself?
Although God brings good out of evil, He will not allow evil to stand and go unpunished.
Right. Yeah, evil is going to be dealt with, and for lack of a better description, God may have to tolerate this evil while this evil is being addressed. But that doesn't mean that He's going to forget this. It doesn't mean that this will go unreconciled and undealt with. God doesn't just ignore the evil. He may have to postpone his dealings with it, but it doesn't mean he has forgotten what Babylon had done, beyond what he asked him to do.
Can you tell me what the daughter of Babylon is? 33.
Let me go back and look, Rob.
It's mentioned in other places too. Mentioned in Isaiah 47 and 1 there again.
Yeah,
I understand the threshing floor because the spoils of a conquering nation, sometimes they refer to it as reaping the harvest of the victory.
mhm.
But the daughter of Babylon has left me out of line.
Sometimes they say the daughter of Jerusalem or the daughter of Paden. And I always thought they were talking about the people.
Yeah. I can't give you an exact answer to that, Bob, to be honest with you, because it wasn't something I had looked at or thought about. You can't read on my screen, I know it's too small, but I'm looking, try to see if I can come up with maybe why certain things are described in the ways that they are. But at any rate, some implication, just at a quick glance at what I was looking at, that phrase may be referring to the locations that had relationship in the land. So daughter meaning the cities of that, here's Babylon, and then here's location A, location B, location C, location D. They're the daughters of. And so the individual cities fall, the towns and villages fall, and are succumb as the nations as well. That was a quick read that I had just looking at it. Was one description I just read real quick. That may not be accurate. I'm just trying to give you something to think about.
There's a threshing floor, it separates the good from the bad,
Right.
sort of.
Well, I mean, it's a place that they thresh out the wheat.
Yeah.
So that kind of description. But really, at the end of the day, the whole description is their destruction's coming, judgment's coming. I mean, there's lots of little detailed kind of symbolic descriptions. It all has the same influence of their destruction.
Yeah, winnowing is separating the good
Bad.
from the bad.
Yeah.
Brian, I'll give you two quick verses in Revelation that kind of correspond with that destruction in that manner. And I looked, verse 14, chapter 14, verse 14. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and upon the cloud one sat like the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. And another angel came out of the temple, crying with a loud voice to him that sat on the cloud, Thrust in thy sickle and reap, for the time is come for thee to reap, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. And that is the situation with Babylon at this time.
The situation with Rome. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Can you compare what he wrote to Judah and Jerusalem? It's the same as he wrote to Babylon.
Yeah, at the end of the day, the symbolic language, the details, the kinds of descriptions used, but the entire, you could have spent, in some senses, we could have spent one study and summed up the book. God brings judgment against evil, and it doesn't matter who you are, or how big you are, or how powerful you are, or how influential you are. When God determines that you're worthy of judgment, He'll bring it. If it's His own people, if it's another nation, whoever it is. And that really, it's a long, long book to get to that point, but really that's the point. That's the message of the book of Jeremiah.
God says something that's going to happen.
Yeah.
That was destruction that time. For us in the world, it's going to happen.
At the same point, when there's promises made, we need to recognize what God has said.
Don't trust in self, but trust in God.
Yeah, yeah.
Kind of like Matthew 6:19.
Everyone that had trusted in themselves had created greater challenges for themselves. So let's look at this. I don't know how well you can see that chart. That's the thing with charts. They're great in front of you, hard because you want to get all the information on there. It's hard. But just want you to notice, if you were to sum up the book, you had 29 chapters. From the beginning of the book, chapter 1 to chapter 29, you had 29 chapters where Jeremiah is talking about the judgment of God, and he's doing it in somewhat sermon form. He's preaching to concerning it while he's connected to Judah. Judah's in trouble because of their idolatry in the first 6 chapters. I can't make this larger than slide you across it. Judah's idolatry is referenced time and time again in chapters 7 through 10. Judah was rebellious. He describes that very vividly in chapters 11 through 15. Judah is like clay at the potter's hands, if you remember that description in chapter 16 to 20. Judah is in a leadership crisis. We studied that in chapters 21 through 25. Judah is in opposition to God, 26 through 29. And then he took that breath, if you remember in our study, from chapters 30 through 33, where he talked about there's hope. There's going to be a remnant. There's going to be a restoration. There's a great hope that's on the horizon way out here with the coming of Jesus. And so he took that moment and he spent some time talking about hope. He got a little more historical. Chapters 34 to 36, he talked about events happening before the fall of Judah. Chapters 37 through 39, he kind of talked about some things during the fall. 40 to 45, he was talking about it after the fall of Judah. And then, as we've just studied in chapters 46 through 51, he talked about God's judgments against Gentile nations, Babylon, Edom, Egypt, and all that. That's been the book. Now, here's the trick. And I don't know how much time you spent studying any of this. Did anybody find chapter 52 odd? Raise your hand. I'll let you do that. I'm putting my hand up. The truth is, chapter 52 doesn't fit. It doesn't fit. Even in this approach that Jeremiah has had, with some sermon form, some historical form, somewhat out of order at times, talks about some things, and goes back to some other things, it doesn't seem to fit. In fact, if you went and you read 2 Kings chapter 24 and chapter 25, you're going to almost be looking at the same exact thing. There are many who are, in fact, most conclude that chapter 52 was not written by Jeremiah. That chapter 52 was some other inspired man who saw a hole in Jeremiah's historical message, some things that he didn't account for in chapter 39 in particular, I believe. And so another inspired man comes along and he finishes the historical perspective, basically adding the very same history that you could go read. If you go read 2 Kings chapter 24 and chapter 25, you're going to read almost the exact same thing that chapter 52 says, almost verbatim. You'll see it. And most of the scholars agree that you're probably not dealing with Jeremiah in chapter 52. And here's the other reason they say that. Does anybody find anything interesting with what he says at the end of chapter 51? Now, I realize he uses a phrase that we're somewhat familiar with in a different fashion. But notice, he's done all these things. And then what's the concluding sentence? These are the words of Jeremiah.
Like that's the ending of it.
Right. So it doesn't make much sense that Jeremiah says, these are my words. Except for chapter. Right? And so most likely, chapter 52 is not Jeremiah. Most likely, chapter 52 was some other inspired writer that creates an appendix. Is that right? Or appendix, is that right? whatever they call that, and adds it, attached one more piece of history that Jeremiah didn't give detail about in his book. Now, again, friends, I'm trying, without going through a whole study of how we got our Bible, there's no Hebrew, okay, there's not a Hebrew document sitting out there that goes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, okay? What we have are pieces. You get a piece, you get a piece, you get a piece, you get a piece. You get collections, determination of what is authorized, providence of God obviously involved in that, and it's determined what belongs in the canon of Scripture. What really was from inspired men. And so it's absolutely easily understandable that a piece of history, though maybe just as inspired, but was added and not really belonging to Jeremiah. Sometimes you get a piece and you don't know where's it go, who's it belong to, and so it gets associated with Jeremiah. From everything I can read, why chapter 52 doesn't look like it belongs is probably because it doesn't. And if you want to study chapter 52, we already did that. It was called 2 Kings 24 and 25. We did it back when we studied the Kings.
As soon as you brought all this up, I just kind of assumed that was just a quick summary.
Yeah, but it doesn't even, it goes back to Jehoiachin, and real quick, one of the things that they mention is because otherwise Jeremiah doesn't talk about the treatment that Jehoiachin receives. In the 37th year of the captivity, Jehoiachin's basically, while he gets taken out of prison, and he's given privileges that he had not had. If this chapter 52 isn't attached to the book of Jeremiah, I don't think we see that in Jeremiah's historical record. And so that's why most believe that whoever has put this together, why it gets associated with Jeremiah's book, because it completes the history portion of Jeremiah's descriptions of the events of the captivity.
Basically, whoever wrote it just put it intended.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair conclusion about where chapter 52 comes from. Because it seems to me that at the end of chapter 51, he puts I'm done with this, right? This is complete. And this chapter gets. So that's why I said it was going to get interesting when we got to chapter 52. We've already looked at that history back when we studied the Kings. It's the same piece. So here's what I want you to do. Lamentations chapter 1. Let's look at his other work, starting on Sunday. Lord willing, when we come back, we'll jump over into Lamentations chapter 1. That gives us a few weeks here, the rest of September, to finish and do Lamentations, so that by October, we'll move away from, we've been 6 months here, so we'll move away from this kind of study and something come October.